Okay, so let me tell y'all what happened this week. This week, conservatives through the Supreme Court took another crack at the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And so for those who don't know, the 1965 Voting Rights Act is basically the piece of legislation that gave black folks the right in practice to be able to vote. So basically, before the Voting Rights Act was passed, what you had was black people had the right to vote, but only on paper. So in 1870, the 15th Amendment was passed, and that's what gave black folks the right to vote. But immediately after that constitutional amendment was passed, what you saw was white people in large across the country having their lawmakers draw up laws that would basically that were voter suppression. White folks would use their bodies to physically stop black folks from voting. There was massive intimidation, poll taxes. Black people were literally murdered just for stating their intention to vote. And so the 1965 Voting Rights Act is the piece of legislation that basically made it illegal to do anything to make it harder for black folks primarily, but really any population to vote. So it basically gave equal rights and protection on the right to vote. And so this week, what you see is the Supreme Court has basically now gutted another part of the Voting Rights Act, because what they have basically said is if states draw a map during the redistricting process, which is, you're familiar with this. Every year, you'll hear about court fights where lawmakers are fighting over whether or not a map is discriminatory. And you see these fights come back to the courts over and over again. And then sometimes the districts for like who you're going to vote for state house or state senate, or even at the federal level, will have to be redrawn. So that's what I'm referencing when I say redistricting. So basically with this new ruling from the Supreme Court is saying that if a map is drawn that was not intentional about being discriminatory, like doing racial discrimination, then that will no longer matter. So before this ruling, if a map was racially discriminatory, then it didn't matter if that was the intention or not of the lawmaker. It was just the bottom line was the map is discriminatory and the map could not hold up in court. So now what the Supreme Court is saying with this ruling this week is the map will only be struck down if you can prove that there was intentional racial discrimination. So let me just break it down for you. Basically what that means is unless the lawmakers were using the N-word when they discussed the maps and literally said things like, we don't want black folks to vote, that is the only way that you can prove racial discrimination. And we all know that that is garbage. So another thing about this, for me, this is heartbreaking to see because, I dealt with fighting conservatives on some of the tactics that they would use when I served in the Georgia House of Representatives. So I served in the Governmental Affairs Committee, which dealt with election law. And I always had to fight Republicans on not doing things like cracking and packing. So cracking, and I'm going to tell you why this relates to the decision this week that the Supreme Court made. But basically, cracking is where conservatives would try to take a group of black people. So let's say you have like a majority black area. They would take groups of black people in that area. And let's say you take like 5% of black people in a largely black area and you draw them into a district with 95% white people. That's an example of cracking, which would dilute the voting power. Packing is basically the opposite. Packing is where you say, okay, let's just take all the black people and put them all in one district and just concede that we're going to have some outright, pretty much all black districts, and just concede that some districts are going to be black. And then we can create even more white districts by basically putting all the black people into one district. And so black folks end up with less representation because everybody is put in one district versus putting folks together in the communities where maps actually make sense. So this is where you'll see stuff like, and people have said, even my district that I had in the House, one side of the road is in the district, the other side is not. A lot of that stuff comes from heavy gerrymandering. And so with this decision this week, this is basically the Supreme Court saying, oh yeah, you can do it. You can do it. You can do cracking and packing. And unless there is racial discrimination that is literally proved to be intentional, the map can hold up. And so, you know what? It's like, for me, this is just another example of what I found to be very heartbreaking, serving as a legislator. The thing that was heartbreaking for me was seeing oppression being voted in real time. And then also the larger thing of that always stood out to me was it was truly amazing to me that you would have a group of people. And when I say a group, I'm referencing, the Republican Party is still majority, like it's pretty much all white people. They got a few black and brown folks who support Republicans, but for the most part, white people as a whole in this country, pretty much since the 1965 Voting Rights Act, continue to, as a majority, vote Republican. So the thing that was heartbreaking was to see a group of people work so hard to make sure that another group of people, meaning black people, will not have the same rights as them. White people in this country have never had their right to vote to be challenged the way that black people have. They've certainly never had their right to vote challenged in a way that is as intentional, relentless in the way that black people have. Yes, white women got their right to vote a lot later than white men, but white people as a whole have never had their right to vote challenged in a way that black people have. And so black folks have all had to consistently fight for their right to vote, like I said, ever since 1870. And so to me, the questions that come to mind are, just think about that. How you're already set with the rights that you have, but then as a group, you're going to work overtime to make sure that another group cannot have those same rights. That's unbelievable. How hateful do you have to be? And no, it's not all white folks that come with this attitude, but like I said, the majority of white folks in this country still vote Republican. And so, this isn't a video about, oh, hey, Democrats are like the savior for black people. No, it's not to say that at all, because I have plenty of critiques for the Democratic Party and I don't hold back on them either. But what I am saying is it is consistently conservatives, Republicans who are working overtime to make sure that nobody else enjoys the rights that they have historically and collectively enjoyed as a whole. And so that was actually one of the most heartbreaking things to deal with consistently on a daily basis, because being a black person myself, I know that my community was going to have to deal with the results of that.